You're listening to the Decidedly podcast with Sanger Smith and Sean Smith. Our mission is to help business owners like you defeat bad decision-making so you can improve your health, wealth, and relationships. We do this by digging deep into the stories and expertise of our guests and distilling their knowledge into actionable wisdom for you to carry into your life and business. If you're new to the show, welcome. Be sure to hit the subscribe button so you won't miss out on any of our weekly episodes. If you prefer to watch this week's episode, head on over to YouTube for the full video. Now, let's get into this week's episode and defeat bad decision-making in your life and business.
You know how you get down rabbit holes sometimes?
I do that a lot.
Yeah. I got down one last night.
Ooh, what was it?
Here was the rabbit hole. It was things that the ultra wealthy do that you don't know about.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I was reading that when the ultra wealthy.
Should we guess? Oh, you already know.
Well, I know already.
Oh, okay. Well,
but I'll just tell you. So when they travel, they don't go stay at the Holiday Inn or the Hilton.
That makes sense.
Right. There are these hotels that cater to ultra wealthy that don't even advertise.
Huh.
Like you can't find them. You can't Google them. They're just hidden. Kind of like those, just like those hidden bars.
Yeah.
That you can get into and you kind of have to know the password. They travel like that.
Interesting.
And that companies like luxury brands custom make stuff for them that you can't buy. And I realized I had come across this in my life. So I was working early in my career. I was at an architecture firm, and we were working on this project. And the woman who had donated the money for this project, it was a chapel. We go out to the parking lot, and she's getting in her car, and I said, I've never seen a Cadillac station wagon.
Yeah.
Which is what she had. It was like old school station with
this
the wood.
Back when Cadillacs were super cool.
Yeah. This was in like the late 80s, right? So she had a Cadillac station wagon, looked just like Cadillac on the front, had the wood paneling, the whole bit, right? And I said, wow, I didn't know Cadillac made station wagons. She said they don't. And I said, well, where did you get it? She goes, if you talk to people, you can get stuff done. Wow. And she just kind of blew it off and got in her car, drove away. I said, how did she? And it wasn't until I was getting down this rabbit hole, I was like, she's at a different level.
Yeah. Different world there.
It's a different world.
She didn't go to David McDavid.
No, she didn't just go to the Cadillac store and, talk to the local salesman who came running out to her in the parking lot.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, see how fun it is to be curious?
Yeah.
Speaking of curiosity, our guest today, David Robson, is an expert on the topic, and he's going to help you be more curious. He is an award-winning science writer specializing in the extremes of the human brain and behavior. Today, we talked about the science and the importance of building strong social connections, the power of curiosity, how to become more curious, and some myths maybe about how we're perceived in the eyes of other people. So if you look to improve your own relationships, get better at small talk, or kind of avoid the nonsense of small talk altogether, and you're curious about being more curious, then this episode's for you. You're going to learn a lot from David. So stick around. I'm Sanger Smith with my dad, Sean Smith. This is Decidedly. David, welcome.
Hey, thanks so much for inviting me.
Yeah, all the work that you did on the laws of connection was so great. There's so much content about likability, and I know it's going to be really valuable for Sean to hear all of that.
Yeah, my circle of friends, I don't think forms a circle.
I'm just kidding.
David, thanks for being here. One of the things that I do when in doing this podcast on looking at decision making, I read a lot of books about decision making and how the brain works. And I had picked up The Intelligence Trap. It was like 2.5 years ago or so, and read that book. mentioned it to Morgan that I wanted to talk with you, and I guess it took that long for us to connect and to get together. So I'm glad you're here.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm so glad that you did read The Intelligence Trap. Yeah, it feels like quite a while ago since I wrote that, but yeah, I'm still.
Yeah. It was. I don't know when that came out. It was a while back.
5 years ago. Yeah.
Normally, I will have I think the subtitle on that is Why Smart People Make Dumb Decisions, and normally I'll have
made for me.
Well, I was going to say normally I'll have you read them afterwards, but you know why I didn't?
Are making any dumb decisions?
Oh, I walked into that.
Yeah.
What took you from going from a background in science and math to working on how the brain works and human behavior? That's a big change, it seems like.
Yeah, I mean, it had always been something that had interested me, actually. So I studied maths at university, and I specialized in kind of statistics, how to interpret scientific studies, which turned out to be super useful in my journalism career, writing about science. But throughout my degree beforehand, I'd always been really interested in the human mind, how we can make the most of our potential. So I'd read a lot of books that covered that research. I'd read magazines that, look at that research. And then when I started my journalism career, it just seemed very natural for me to gravitate to that. So very early on, when I was working at New Scientist magazine, which is like the kind of British Scientific American, I just kept on writing and editing pieces about the brain, and I just fell in love with that research. I just loved finding new ways of understanding myself and being able to then communicate that to readers so that they could understand themselves better, and so that they could use all of these evidence-based strategies to improve the way they were thinking and behaving and learning.
In what way do you think studying math at a high level helped you bring a new perspective to studying the brain?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of ways, actually. So firstly, I just think it helps me to understand the results themselves. Are the effect sizes meaningful? Are they statistically significant? Are they robust? So that definitely helps. But also, a lot of the latest neuroscience is mathematical. So, we talk about the brain being this kind of prediction machine. Well, that whole theorem that the brain is creating these simulations of what is going to happen in the future based on its best guess from the experiences in the past. When you take that to this super technical level, that's all based on this theorem called Bayes' theorem, which is a statistical tool that we can use to build, to update our kind of probabilities, our brain's estimations of probabilities. So the brain is using this, in all of its processing, essentially. I think if I hadn't studied mathematics, understanding that kind of concept would have been very difficult for me, but actually it immediately made intuitive sense to me. And that really helped me, for example, with my second book, The Expectation Effect, which is completely built on this idea of the prediction machine being the fundamental means by which the brain operates and understands the world around it.
That's interesting, because that seems like a very, very, very important thing to have on your side when you're trying to determine conclusions about how the brain works. There's a few, I guess, categories of study that we all recognize we don't know anything about, right? Like space. I have no opinions on space. I don't know anything about it, right? I went to the NASA headquarters once in the 5th grade. That's pretty much it. So you could tell me how space works, and I'm just going to trust you. The brain and how the brain works, I feel like a lot of people, we all have a brain. We all have thoughts. We all have thoughts about those thoughts. And so no matter how statistically significant, and I'm sure you've experienced this, no matter how statistically significant your findings are, you'll find people who disagree with you because that's not their anecdotal experience.
Yeah, I mean, that is quite a little bit frustrating for me, to be honest. And I get it at home a lot from my partner, who will always say, well, I don't believe it because that's not what I've noticed. And, I try to explain that actually, even our subjective kind of experience of the way the brain works is often biased. So, we aren't always the best witnesses of how we're making decisions or what's driving our behaviors. And that is why you need to use the scientific method to really probe that and to understand, what's actually going on there. Like, are you being swayed by something that you hadn't even considered beforehand? And so that's what, the scientific research is really doing. And that, sometimes we do have strong intuitions about what is and isn't true about the brain. And often we can carry two of these intuitions that are totally contradictory at the same time. And what the science is doing is trying to separate, well, which is true and which isn't true. Having said that, I think we always should acknowledge that in health in general and in psychology in particular, there is individual variation. Some people, people's ways of thinking are different. And what I'm really trying to explore in my books is, the breadth of that variation too, because those individual differences are in themselves very interesting to understand. And knowing where you lie on these, they're often spectrums or spectra. Knowing where you lie on those spectra can be insightful and useful in its own right. So I absolutely think we do need to acknowledge the fact that one person's reaction to an event will be very different from another person's, and understanding what's driving those differences can be very instrumental in helping us to perform better in the future.
Yeah, I think one of the ways we can try and perform better is looking at the biases that we have, particularly as business owners and leaders. We form an answer. I think a lot of business owners come to answers fairly quickly, and then you spend a lot of time, or at least I do, sort of rationalizing why that's the best answer. In other words, I found the conclusion. Now I'm seeking out answers on confirmation bias as to why that answer I came up with initially is right, rather than approaching it the opposite way, is seeking out the right answer and spending energy there. Do you find that true?
Yeah, I mean, post hoc justification is a huge problem. And so my book, the intelligence trap, that's really partly what is driving the intelligence trap, because the more intelligent someone is, the better often they are at making those justifications. Once they've come to a conclusion, potentially irrationally, not looking at all of the data correctly, it could be driven by this kind of gut feeling, bias, emotion. Then they just apply their intelligence to create a good story around why that should be the case. And the best example I could find in history to illustrate this point was Arthur Conan Doyle, who, in the Sherlock Holmes books, clearly understood the importance of questioning our assumptions, of gathering evidence in an open-minded way, applying logical deduction. But then in his private life, he had quite bizarre ideas, for example, about the existence of fairies. He was fooled by these schoolgirls who had taken these photos of basically cardboard cutouts from their picture books of fairies that they'd then pinned together and stuck at the end of their garden by this kind of babbling brook. And they took photos, and Arthur Conan Doyle was absolutely certain that this was the paranormal that he was seeing. And he even drew on his knowledge of the latest science. So the relatively new theory of electromagnetism to explain how the fairies could exist in this kind of mysterious realm that wasn't visible to the human eye. So, that's what I call motivated reasoning, which includes confirmation bias, but also includes other errors of thinking that together allow us to just justify what we already believe rather than weighing up the evidence even-handedly.
Yeah, I think it's an easy trap to fall into. When we look at that, there are certain places we go to seek out confirmation of our opinions. There's certain news channels you'll watch, certain news channels you don't watch because you want that validation. I think it's easy to fall into that.
Yeah, it's very easy. I mean, we're all vulnerable to that, but some people are less vulnerable than others. And so you look at what kind of predicts who's more likely to suffer from motivated reasoning, and you can see some reliable traits like curiosity. So people vary in how curious they are to learn new information for the sake of knowing that new information. people who are more curious tend to be less susceptible to motivated reasoning, because if they find a fact that disagrees with their point of view, well, they will incorporate that just for the sheer fascination of having something that confounded them. Similarly, people with what we call a growth mindset tend to be less susceptible to motivated reasoning. They tend to be more intellectually humble. I think the growth mindset is quite a well-known concept, but for people who aren't familiar with it, it's just this idea that that things like intelligence are not necessarily this kind of inherent, innate trait that we have, but we can change our reasoning abilities, our performance at school, our academic credentials over time with effort and practice. And what you find is that people who have a growth mindset, they are more open-minded to the idea that their opinions might be wrong, because it's not threatening their sense of intelligence, because they know that if they have been wrong, they can learn why they were wrong, and that can improve their reasoning in the future. So, we can look at these different traits and kind of dispositions, and we can see that some people are consistently more rational, ultimately less susceptible to motivated reasoning, and more rational because of that.
Do we know what makes someone curious, and can people easily change that about themselves?
Yeah, it's a great question. So it definitely comes partly from our upbringing. So if you were encouraged to be curious as a kid, so your parents and teachers kind of celebrated the fact that you were asking questions and kind of modeled curiosity themselves. So they showed that if they had a question that they wanted to answer, that they could go pursue that knowledge.
I guess Sean is thinking he did a good job.
No, I'm taking all the credit. I'm taking all the credit.
Yeah.
Okay.
It makes a big difference. But I am a strong believer that we can cultivate curiosity as an adult. And sometimes I think it's just giving us enough time and space, giving ourselves enough time and space to do so. So, one of the things I found with my work is that I can, if I become overly rigid with, say, my writing schedule, to the point that it means I don't have any possibility of exploring something that I find interesting just for the sake of it, rather than because it's specifically going to feed into a particular article, that impairs my creativity and my curiosity if that becomes a habit, because I become too kind of narrowly focused. I become too myopic. So actually just leaving space in your day to be able to pursue something just purely for interest, that can become a mental habit that will then spill over into lots of different areas of work or decision making.
Yeah, and being forced to talk to someone who is not curious, oh my gosh, there's fewer things worse than that.
That's rough. I have a friend of mine who owns a business and has had several people leave his organization, and I started asking him questions about what they said. And like he had done no sort of exit interviews, didn't ask any questions, wasn't curious as to why it's like, well, maybe this is going to keep on happening then.
Yeah.
Going to keep on happening.
Yeah. That's what we find, when we look at different corporate cultures, when you look at kind of huge disasters like the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, and you could see that the corporate culture was often discouraging the employees from being curious, because they were rewarded for kind of investigating anything that wasn't on their checklist of things to do. So it was easier to turn a blind eye to any kind of anomaly. And so with something like Deepwater Horizon, people had noticed that there were things like changes in the pressure of the oil rig that they couldn't explain. So if they'd looked more deeply, they would have found that there were these gas leaks that eventually caused the explosion. But no one actually pursued that because it wasn't part of their particular job description to do that at the time. Same with things like the Challenger disaster with NASA. There were lots of near misses, but no one was following them up to ask, well, what's the underlying cause of this foam flying off of the spacecraft casing that eventually was going to cause the huge rupture that caused the crash. So, it's really important within organizations that managers are encouraging employees to look at things that aren't that they can't explain, and then try to explain them rather than punishing them, say, for not having completed their workflow as efficiently as possible.
Sometimes I will ask. I get accused. Some of my friends don't appreciate this about me, but I will ask a lot of questions, and I had somebody tell me to stop asking questions.
Oh, really?
They were this new endeavor they were starting on. I started asking questions. They're like, "Hey, wait, man, don't do this to me right now. I'm trying to go on a certain path." And so clearly there are questions that, we can ask of others. If I'm curious, I'm going to ask you a lot of questions. Are there questions you think we should be asking ourselves that can create the curiosity around the paths we're traveling, or the decisions we're making, or the connections we're creating? What questions should we be asking ourselves? What should I be curious about?
I think, to be honest, I feel like the more flexible and fluid we can be with curiosity, the better. It doesn't always have to be instrumental. And I mean, you don't always have to know how the knowledge that you're pursuing is going to help you in the long run, because often, it's just through coincidence and chance that the things that we feel that we find out actually turn out to be useful for our decision making. And you don't want to be too rigid. So I think when you just feel that kind of spark of interest, when you're just you just think for a fleeting second, you have this, I feel like almost like this kind of lightness in my chest, and this kind of question, why is that? Oh, that doesn't seem right. What could be behind that particular fact that I found? Just go ahead and look it up, or make a note of it to go to look up later. So, just, I guess, employing your metacognition. So having the self-awareness to just see when something has sparked your interest. And I noticed this first actually when I was doing my master's degree. And I'll be honest, in the first term, I didn't really find it as rewarding and interesting as I was hoping it would be, because it felt so much more abstract even than I had expected it to be, especially when I was doing very, what we call pure maths, which is, about the real theoretical foundations of all mathematical theory. So right down to how we can even prove that addition and subtraction and multiplication are actually universal laws rather than just things that happen to work. And, it wasn't that fascinating to me. But what I did find was that when I was looking in a textbook, there was just a brief mention of one of the mathematicians' kind of autobiographies, and how they came to come up with one of these discoveries, and the kind of rivalries they had with another mathematician. And I realized, well, I can use this as this kind of hook to get me interested in the subject more generally, if I understand the people behind the abstract topic. And so just by pursuing that, I actually learned a lot more effectively. I expanded my knowledge a lot more deeply. Even though it wasn't directly relevant, I was never going to be asked those things in an exam, but it helped me to learn the other stuff. And that's what we see in the psychological research on curiosity, is that it actually enhances learning. There's this kind of spillover effect. So if you're curious about one fact, anything that kind of you learn around the same time as that, you learn a lot more easily. And that's because the brain, when you're curious, the brain is releasing more dopamine, which is really important for the formation and consolidation of memories. So it can be really helpful. And that's why I don't think we should be too worried about what we're pursuing. We should just be pursuing the things that do light that spark of interest to start with.
One thing I'm curious about that you're working on is the likability gap, that we tend to underestimate how likable we are in the eyes of other people. And that's something that I had never even considered, but as I was reading your work on it, I'm like, oh, of course other people have felt this feeling that I've felt. And I know that about other negative feelings I feel. Other people have been sad and insecure, but I've never noticed I do that. I turn down invitations from people because I think they're just being polite, etc. I think people, I question their motivation, but I've never invited someone that I don't want to actually hang out with. I've never approached a friendship with this perverse motivation. Why am I putting this on other people?
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, the liking gap is just, as you said, it's when we might have had a really good rapport with someone that we have just met or that we barely know. We really enjoyed the conversation, but we kind of go away from that conversation assuming that we liked the other person more than they liked us. And what the research shows is that this is such a general bias that the chances are that the other person who met you is feeling exactly the same. So they assume that they liked you more than you liked them. And you can see how that gap is, it's pushing you apart. It's preventing you from building on that rapport to create a more lasting friendship, because you both have those doubts about, what was really going on in that conversation. So I find this important for two reasons. One is that we know that feelings of social connection are fundamental for our health and well-being, and our job satisfaction, how much we enjoy our work. And if you are experiencing the liking gap with lots of people, you're just not profiting from the amount of social connection that is actually out there. There's social connection that is easily within your grasp, but you're questioning it, you're doubting it, you're not feeling it. Secondly, when you look at the liking gap, you can find that it is a discouragement from doing the kinds of behaviors that would help us to build better relationships. So it stops us from meeting those people a second time. Like you say, it causes us to turn down invitations when we we could go to a party and have a really good time and actually build on that relationship. In the workplace, it prevents us from having fruitful collaborations with people, because if we don't trust that they like us or respect us at work, we just don't feel so comfortable asking them to take part in our project, or giving them or asking them for honest feedback about what we're doing.
How do you get to the point where you recognize the proper amount of self-assessment on this liking gap? Or we've all been around people who have no awareness that we don't like them. How do you not go too far, I guess?
I mean, that is the big fear that we all have, is that you're accidentally going to be too needy with someone who really doesn't want to be your friend. But the research shows we're just too pessimistic. So we could all afford to be a little bit more relaxed, and on average, the odds are going to be stacked in our favors. That's definitely worth remembering, that, when you have those doubts, just consider that you could maybe be a bit braver with trying to build on the connection in the future, and the chances are that it will pay off. But we should be sensitive with that. I think this is the key. You just because you suspect the liking gap might be misleading you and causing you to be overly pessimistic, it doesn't mean that you have to then be really full on in trying to build that friendship. But it just might mean that you could sensitively ask, with the option of the other person saying no and you accepting it very graciously, do you want to meet up for coffee to discuss this new idea that I've had? Or, do you want to come to the cinema to see this film that we'd both discussed and that you said you had interest in? It's just, those small steps, see how the other person responds. And if they're positive, then, you'll soon find that very organically the friendship starts to grow without you having to put in, a huge amount of thought or effort. But I think what a lot of us do is just we fall down at the first hurdle. We don't make those first moves at all. So yeah, that's how I see it really, is just being a bit more open-minded, just allowing the possibility for the friendship to flourish, to actually occur. And if you start getting signals that the other person's not interested, and they seem like real signals, to just back off and, maybe let them make the first move instead.
What are those real signals? I've never experienced anything like that.
I mean, I think if you ask someone a couple of times, do you want to meet up, and they say no each time, and it doesn't seem like a great
that happens
reason.
to other people.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So what has changed in your own life now that you have this information? Do you present yourself differently when you go to parties? Do you engage in the small talk that everybody hates in a different way? Is there something different about you now that you have been empowered with what sounds like something that should really be a confidence boost?
Yeah, I mean, my life has changed quite a lot from this, because I did feel a lot of shyness when I was a teenager and in my 20s. And then, it kind of lingered into my 30s, until I was writing this book. So, just learning about the liking app has helped me to feel a bit braver in those kinds of contexts that I mentioned. So now I very rarely turn down an invitation. If I'm asked to go to a party or to meet up with someone, I just assume they wouldn't have asked me if they didn't want me to go. Well, and they shouldn't have asked me if they didn't want me to go.
Yeah, exactly.
Say,
if they did, that's their fault.
Right, exactly. That's on them.
They didn't want you there, their fault.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's on them, not me. Right. And I haven't had any bad experiences at that yet. Like, people have been very good at hiding it if they do resent me turning up to these things. But I genuinely think it just proved to me actually how wrong those assumptions have been. One of the things that we can do that really helps us to build good relationships with our friends or colleagues is just to be more open, to engage in something that we call self-disclosure. So you mentioned, how everyone hates small talk, and it's often just because we kind of rely so much on the trivialities of life, like what the traffic was like, what the weather's like, that it's kind of cringy for both people, because no one's really invested in knowing what, and having those conversations. So the research shows we should actually just be braver in what we tell other people, to say that opinion that might not be super fashionable, but is something that you really believe in, or, to acknowledge that you have like a strange music taste that maybe the other person will also share, or they will at least find it interesting that you are idiosyncratic in that way. And to talk more about the kind of inner feelings that we have. So the things, the hopes, the fears, the dreams that we have. The research shows we have this bias. That means that we assume other people aren't interested in those things, but people really do want to hear about it. They actually care what's driving you and what's making you feel vulnerable, and they respond appropriately, and they often respond in kind with their own self-disclosure.
My attitude in social settings like these trivial small talk stuff, going to a party where I don't know anybody, accepting a social invitation, it's changed a lot, just like yours has, David. I attribute a lot of that to a friend of mine who just had a radically different attitude than me, of not caring at all about what other people thought. He was like, this sucks for both people to have this small talk. I'm going to at least entertain myself.
I know exactly who you're talking about.
Yes. Anyone who's met him knows who I'm talking about. So he, instead of approaching it the way I was, which was, I wonder if they like me, I wonder if I'm talking about the things that they're interested in, I'm all concerned. He's like, I'm just going to have fun with it for myself. So he would ask like the most out-of-pocket question and try to throw them off, try to mess with them, try to, get them to react in a way that was like, I can't believe you're talking about this right now. And so I started to do that. And I have this lunch that I host every month. And the person who was hosting the lunch before me would open the lunch with like an icebreaker question, so we could get, deeper answers later on down the road in the middle of the lunch. And I noticed the icebreakers were just as like surface level as the small talk that I hated, where it would be like, what's something that you're thankful for?
What do y'all think about the weather?
Yeah. Or what do what was your vacation you went on? Or like nothing that really required any vulnerability. And so the answers, I hated them. And so I would get a lot of attention by answering in a way that like rejected the I would give them a stupid answer. And people were like, oh, your answers are so funny. So it's like, it's my turn to ask these icebreaker questions. It's like, what's a good icebreaker that I could start with? And so I thought about it for a couple of days, knowing that I was going to have this. And I knew what I didn't like about how it was done before. So I show up and I go, all right, guys, I got it. Icebreaker. I don't know any of y'all in this room. When's the last time you shit your pants?
Good Lord.
What's so funny is everybody reacted the way Sean did. They were like, but you know what? It's even better.
Everybody's got an answer.
Everybody had a story. Every single person in that room had a story. And these are serious business people. Like, they were all dressed nice. We're at a fancy steakhouse and they're sitting there telling poopy pants stories.
Oh my God.
And you know what? We had a great time. Everyone got along. Everyone had hilarious story. And then we got really deep after that because I was willing to be vulnerable and other people were willing to answer vulnerably. And I think I had underestimated prior to that point how willing other people would be also to play along in the way that you're talking about.
There is you've read David Sedaris's books, I'm sure. There is I can't remember which book it's in, but he talks about he's intentionally asking people, whether it's a cab driver or somebody who comes up to his table signing a book.
Yeah.
He always will ask them like third level deep questions or off the wall questions. And
so you fear death.
Well,
right
kind of like that. Right. Somebody's coming to, he's going to sign the book and he asks, I think he asked this one woman, when was the last time you touched a monkey?
Mm-hmm.
Right. And which is just a dumb, absurd question. And her response was, do you smell it on me?
Wow.
Which led to, because she worked at a zoo. He didn't know that. It led to an interesting discussion.
Yeah.
But you never know, kind of like your question. You never know where that's going to lead. Have you found that in sort of the after the Me Too movement, I think a lot of people, particularly between male and female, those connections were separated. There was sort of this barrier or hesitancy that, hey, I'm going to do something wrong. I don't want to ask anything that might go awry. Have you noticed it's become more difficult to build stronger connections in the face of some of that stuff?
I mean, I haven't seen good research on that, but I have no doubt that is a concern for people of both genders. I think also, like I was at a festival talking to a psychologist, and she had said that, even though she really appreciated in my book the research on why it's good to talk to strangers and how in the vast majority of cases it can we have really good reactions and people are very friendly and both people go away feeling much better. She also said how she had a bad experience when on the London Underground she had just said some very small piece of small talk to this one guy who then kind of just kept on staring at her for the rest of the journey. It seemed to be following her after she left the, after she left the train and left the station. And, it's a very frightening experience to her. And it was, neither of us could really think of a good solution to avoid this, because to say that she shouldn't have engaged in the small talk, I think is a form of victim blaming as well. And she should be able to feel safe enough to be able to have a basic social interaction with the people around her. But, safety is a concern. And I think also, for guys, they're going to be worried about engaging in that kind of small talk in case they look creepy, in case they seem like they're kind of invading people's privacy. So there's no good solution to that. I think, having situational awareness can help, like making sure that you're, say, when you do engage in things like talking to strangers, that you're in a situation where everyone's comfortable and there's lots of people around, all of that is fundamentally important. But yeah, I think there are issues around this that we have to navigate. I would just say, away from this context of, talking to some people you don't know, when engaging in things like self-disclosure, asking questions, paying compliments, one thing that we can always just ask ourselves is the thing that I'm saying conveying my respect to the other person? Because if it's not, and if there's a chance that it might be read as not conveying respect, then you should maybe back off or think about rephrasing it. And so the obvious example, the one of the researchers Vanessa Bones spoke to me about, was, so she's done a lot of research on compliments and why we don't compliment people as much as we should do. We think nice things about people but don't say it. But that doesn't mean, for example, that a boss should say to his young intern something about her appearance, because that's not really conveying respect in any way that she is likely to appreciate, compared to if he compliments her on her actual work. And the power dynamic definitely shifts the tone of that dynamic, of that conversation, that compliment. So, I do think my laws of connection are, I think they're great rules of thumb that we can use and that we can aspire to. But I do think that we have to use our sensitivity and intelligence to work out when it's appropriate to apply these things and when not to.
Do you find that there's some reason why, other than sort of maybe if it's inappropriate, why people don't give more compliments?
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously there might be concerns about it being appropriate, but actually loads of the compliments we could give are just genuinely lovely things to say about people that no one's really going to feel offended by. You tell someone that you admired their presentation, you thought they had great creativity, or you were really impressed with how they dealt with like this huge crisis, but they navigated it with, in a very calm, collected way. Those are the kinds of things that I don't think you could ever say it's objectifying someone. It's just showing admiration for a skill that is valued in your culture amongst all of the people you're working with. But the problem is we still don't say that kind of compliment. And there are lots of reasons for that. One is that we tend to overestimate how much the other person knows what we feel. So this is a phenomenon in psychology called egocentrism, which means that we often think that our feelings are much more transparent than they really are, because we know what we're feeling. We assume other people will be able to see that too, maybe from our body language or our facial expressions. We forget that they have much less reliable cues than we have to analyze our own state of mind. So we just assume that other people, if we think good of other people, well, they know that we will think good of them. Another problem is that we kind of doubt our own social competence enough to pay the compliment elegantly. So we think we're going to sound clumsy. We might sound a bit kind of goofy saying this thing, that the other person might feel embarrassed just because we're saying it in such a clumsy kind of way. The research again shows we don't need to worry about that. People just really love, in general, they really love hearing your admiration, and they don't really care if you say it using the slightly wrong words. They, what they really are focused on is the warmth. They see it as a kind of gift that you're giving them. They know what your intentions are, which is they, you want to convey something pleasant to them, and they accept it as such. So we underestimate how much it's appreciated, but compliments are almost always appreciated much more than we think.
We created this systematically in my company when we would have team meetings. Is one of the line items in the agenda every week was to go through, and it was expressions of gratitude. What happened was that the things that people ended up being grateful for were relationships internal into the business, which meant that they were complimenting the other person, or they were thanking the other person on the team for something that they had done, and it was sort of highlighting these positive connections. Are there other ways
it turned into 100% thank yous?
Oh yeah, 100%.
It wasn't nobody ever. It eventually got to a point where nobody said anything that they were grateful for. They only said thank you, John, thank you, Susie.
Yeah,
to the point that new people on the team would refer to it as the thank you time.
Yeah.
Even though on the board it says, what are you grateful for? Everybody else, the new people thought that was the time where we were expected to say thank you to someone.
You got to say thanks for something. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I mean, that is, I think, one of the big problems that we have about expressing gratitude, is that we often don't do it in the most effective way possible. So actually just saying thank you to someone is not a bad behavior, certainly not. But we're not really
insulting them, right?
Yeah, all right, exactly. Definitely, yeah, or ignoring them. But what we do in general when we're thanking people, when we're expressing gratitude, is that we tend to turn it back on ourselves. So, it might be like, thank you for solving this problem. It saved me a lot of time, which is fine. Like, you're showing that their action had a positive impact on you. But what would be much more effective is actually turning the thank you into a compliment that focuses on what particular quality of the other person you really appreciated in the action that they performed. So was it their generosity with their time? Was it their creativity? Was it their intelligence? Do you value the fact that they are always supported? So they're very reliable in the way that they will help you. We forget to say these things. We don't probe quite deeply enough into why we feel grateful for the person. And by not making that explicit, we don't get the full benefit of the apology. So they don't feel so good. They don't feel as close and connected to us as they could do if we showed that we're really seeing the person, that we're not just appreciating the interaction, the action itself.
Yeah, that's interesting. Maybe we don't even necessarily know the extent of our gratitude. You know, we're giving a low level, surface level thank you because we haven't really thought it through ourselves. In the same way that giving a compliment is hard, you know, I find it awkward to receive compliments. I try really hard to not
When does that happen?
that I receive them. You can see why it's so hard for me to receive them. But I try to not reject them, right? Like, yeah, you know, I hate when I give someone, oh, you look great today. No, I didn't. Oh, this old dress, this old thing. I just threw my hair together. Okay, well, you know, screw me then. I'll never compliment you again. But rejecting the compliment is harmful. But I find it, I'm not going to sit there and go, yeah, great. I'm like, oh, this is so awkward. They're saying this thing they like about me. I want to like downplay. I want kind of just to move on without making them feel bad for saying it.
You'll just say thank you.
I mean, basically, but it's still awkward. Like, especially when someone makes a show out of it. Yeah. Hey, everybody, I want to sit here and tell Sean how great, look at how good Sean looks in this.
Drag it out.
Look at this. Oh, he is looking great in this shirt. And you're like, okay, chill out. But I feel equally awkward giving a compliment to someone. You know, I feel equally awkward giving a compliment to someone. And I really don't know why. I know why I don't like getting it, but I don't know why I don't like giving it. And a thank you is kind of a version of a compliment that seems easier. A thank you seems easier than a compliment, even though it's a version of a compliment. But I want to work on being more precise with compliments and with thank yous and being more forthcoming with a compliment. Because I do often think that about my friends. Or even sometimes people I've newly met. I'm like, you know what? This guy's funny. But I'm not sitting there. Why not just tell, dude, I think you're hilarious. I just made you funny.
Yeah, exactly.
I feel good for them to hear that.
You know, yeah, I think people, you know, they will appreciate it more. There's an additional benefit to giving compliments and showing gratitude, and it's called the witnessing effect. And so this is, you know, you express gratitude to the person, the kind of object of your gratitude. But actually the people witnessing that conversation, seeing you express your gratitude, what it does is it actually just creates a better culture in general and a better connection within the group. So that's the witnessing effect, is that people will tend to like you more for having seen you express gratitude to this random person. And they will like the other person better as well, because they'll know that they were, you know, valuable to you. So it is something that we should work on as a society, I think, is being better and less embarrassed about giving and receiving compliments. But I think this comes to something else that is about, like, we are really worried about seeming like we're bragging, but other people aren't judging us for bragging nearly as much as we assume. It's actually okay to celebrate our successes as long as we don't make kind of negative comparisons to other people or exaggerate them. But as long as we're just honestly saying, like, I feel really happy to have got this promotion, or to have received this bonus, or to have met the love of my life. You know, other people are just more likely to feel happy for you than to feel resentful or to start questioning whether you're kind of getting too big for your boots.
I have found that when we start, you were talking about vulnerability just a minute ago, and that made me think that in circles of friends, we have a circle of friends, a group of friends that we could call if something was going poorly. You know, hey, I'm struggling with this is going badly. The list of people that we would contact if something goes fantastically well, it shrinks though. Right? The people you call if something was really going well. And I think that is that reluctance to be vulnerable, right? It is that's really scary for a lot of people. I know it is for me. You know, becoming vulnerable, it took me a lot of work.
Like, oh, you're proud of that? nothing, that little stupid thing you did.
To say that I was happy about that, or to say that I really
feels more vulnerable than go, I'm struggling.
Yeah. It's way more vulnerable to express positive emotions about something you did to people, because how are they going to react to that, right?
Yeah.
Are there ways, and I know that you're saying vulnerability is important, and it took me a lot of work to get to the point where I am now. I'm not at point of arrival, but are there ways that we can facilitate appropriate vulnerability in teams that we lead or businesses, where we can structurally sort of encourage and reinforce that vulnerability? Because I agree with you, it's positive in terms of connections.
Yeah, I mean, it is super important. And like you say, I'm glad you draw that parallel, that even, expressing successes and happiness can also be a kind of form of vulnerability, because there's always the risk that the other person, if they react badly, that they'll be kind of raining on your parade. You're showing something that's deep within you, and it hurts more if you get the bad reaction. But the research shows, that's much rarer than we think. Like, people do respond better than we think. So again, it's a kind of an optimistic message that's coming from the research. In terms of encouraging this with, like with our colleagues, with our, the people around us, I do think kind of modeling this behavior gives others the license to do so. And you do see that, in all kinds of self-disclosure, just that once one person has been brave enough to talk about a vulnerability, the other people will too. And it's like you said, with your kind of shocking icebreaker question, actually everyone had a story to share once you had shared your own. And, I think that's very true as well about successes. And to talk about things that make us joyous, and to encourage what I kind of call confelicity. So that's the happiness, the vicarious happiness other people can feel in your success, and vice versa. I think we do just have to make sure that we do this often, and we celebrate other successes as much as our own. So we kind of encourage them to, and we actively show our happiness when they've got some good news. Again, we don't want to fall into that trap of egocentrism where we might feel genuinely good for them, but we don't express it, because that will be leaving them with doubts that maybe you were secretly judging them or thinking something critical. So it's really just being open with our thoughts and making it clear how we feel about ourselves, but also about other people. And once you have that openness, it creates that sense of psychological safety that becomes self-reinforcing. So you gain that culture. The culture grows from that behavior.
We would do annual retreats in my business that with the leadership team and with key members of the team, and unstated on the agenda, but my objective was always to improve or increase the level of comfort with vulnerability, through the activities that we would do, through the questions we would ask, and those types of things. And I found it helpful in terms of the team connections, even though I may not remember exactly what everybody shared, and they may not remember what I shared. They remember that we shared something, and that we now have a deeper connection and deeper level of vulnerability. So I found those things helpful.
Yeah. Well, before we leave, David, I want to say thank you. Thank you for being here, and thank you for exploring your natural inclination to be curious.
What a nice compliment you gave there.
Yeah. I think that it's a very admirable quality, and it's something that I want to model for myself and do more of. Your turn. You do me no.
No.
I mean, it has been a real pleasure for me to.
What would you say is your top decision-making tip for business owners?
Right. I think this really applies throughout all of the research I've covered in all of my books. So it's the number one psychological strategy I use for all kinds of decision-making and emotional regulation. And it's something called psychological distancing. And it comes from the work of Ethan Kross at the University of Michigan. And it's all about just whenever we feel like our emotions are confusing us in some way, and we we're in a state of indecision. We just try to take a step back and to look at this situation from an outside perspective. And there are lots of ways that you can do that. So you could imagine, that there's a kind of fly on your wall observing the scenario or the dilemma that you're facing from a neutral perspective. You could imagine that you're advising a friend who is in the same situation that you are in, but just shifting the role so that you're the person giving advice rather than the person expressing the problem. Or you could imagine that you're kind of looking back on this from a year or 10 years in the future and trying to, what would that kind of future self advise your current self, when it's all played out? What would that future self regret? What would that future self be proud of? Now, in all of these cases, you're not eliminating the emotions that might be swaying your decision making, but you're just slightly muting them by not being so immersed in the situation itself. It's just a small psychological trick to get some to just kind of distance yourself a little from the kind of forces that might be swaying your decisions. And it really does work in all kinds of situations. So it reduces cognitive biases that might be influencing your political opinions, for example, but it also helps you to deal with marital strife. There's a study showing that newlywed couples who were taught this, enjoyed much better marital satisfaction over 2 years than people who hadn't been taught this technique. It can help us with forgiveness. It is just, something that I go to all the time whenever I feel troubled. I use that sense of the psychological distancing to try to see more clearly what really matters in the decision at hand and how I can most constructively move forward.
Thanks for being here, David. Where can people connect with you and the work that you're doing?
So I'm on X. I don't know for how much longer, but I'm D_A_Robson. I'm on Instagram, David A. Robson. And my website is probably the best place to find out more about my books. That's davidrobson.me.
Thank you.
Hey, thanks a lot, David. It was great talking to you.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. Thanks so much.
The takeaway that I had from that really sort of reinforces some of the things we've talked about in other episodes. And that is in looking at how do I avoid making stupid decisions? How do I build stronger connections? A lot of that overlay, the sort of connection on that Venn diagram is improving my curiosity. And so being curious about why am I making this decision? Why did I arrive at that decision so quickly? Is there other information that I need? But then also asking about other people in a genuine way to create a deeper connection. So I think it all centers back to some of those things that we've talked about before is around curiosity.
My biggest takeaway was the liking gap, that we underestimate how much other people like us. And I think that's really empowering. It's going to change how I approach relationships, how I talk to people, and give me a little bit more confidence knowing whatever insecurities I have, these other people are probably experiencing the same thing.
You just made a great decision to listen to this episode of Decidedly. Make another great decision by subscribing to the show. We appreciate the support. It helps business owners like you find our community and defeat bad decision-making in their own lives. For more decision-making insights, check us out at decidedlypodcast.com, on Instagram at decidedlypodcast, or grab a copy of Sanger and Sean's books from the links in the show notes. Finally, we'd like to thank Shelby Peterson of Transcend Media for editing and post-production of the show. Thanks for listening. I'm Morgan, your producer, and this is Decidedly.